You ever have that moment where you think your property is safe and private, and then someone decides it isn't? That was me, walking through my woodland property one crisp morning, when I noticed something strange. Fresh tire tracks on the dirt path I hadn't used in days, and a few footprints that definitely weren't mine. At first, I thought maybe it was a neighbor wandering through, nothing serious. But then I saw the signs: temporary stakes, small flag markers, and even a rough map nailed to a tree. My heart sank. Someone had sold hunting rights on my land, and it wasn't me. The neighbor in question was someone who liked to look helpful, but really just wanted to make a quick buck. I'd always been friendly, waving hello, borrowing a cup of sugar here and there. But clearly, that friendliness didn't extend to respecting property lines. According to the documents I glimpsed later, he had signed agreements with some local hunters, granting them permission to shoot on my land. Without asking, without notifying me. I felt a rush of disbelief, then irritation, then a quiet, simmering determination. Okay, I thought. So you want to make money off my property? Let's see how that works out for you. I didn't yell, I didn't storm over. I walked the perimeter, taking note of everything. The trails they had cleared, the stakes, and the small tree blinds someone had already set up. It was all carefully planned. Someone had thought this through, but none of it was legal. That's the important part. By mid-morning, I had gathered a few photos and jotted down notes about the activity. Every marking, every footstep, every stake was evidence. I wasn't just annoyed, I was building a case. My mind raced, imagining the look on the neighbor's face when he realized the hunters weren't going to get away with this. And then I remembered the local game warden, someone whose job it was to ensure hunting laws were followed. I called him immediately, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. I think someone sold hunting rights on my property without my permission, I said. There are markers, footprints, and even some small blinds set up. Can you help? There was a pause on the other end, a faint chuckle. You've got a real situation there, he said. I'll be out to inspect it today. That was all I needed to hear. While waiting, I walked through the property again, making mental notes of every point of entry, every area where hunters could appear, and imagining how the warden would approach. I felt a mix of satisfaction and amusement. The neighbor might have thought he was clever, lining up clients for hunting rights, but he hadn't counted on me being aware, attentive, or willing to involve authorities. By early afternoon, I heard the distinctive hum of a truck approaching. Sure enough, it was the game warden, uniform crisp, clipboard ready, eyes scanning the terrain with practiced precision. All right, he said, stepping out. Let's see what we have here. I pointed out the stakes, the footpaths, and the small tree blinds. He nodded, jotting notes, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. This is quite organized, he muttered. But it's all on your property. Yes, I said, keeping my tone casual, almost amused. Apparently, someone decided to sell hunting rights here without telling me. The warden raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed with the level of detail and preparation the hunters had put in. That's bold, he said. And illegal. We'll handle it. I couldn't help but grin a little. Bold. Definitely. Illegal? Absolutely. And now, with the game warden involved, the neighbor's scheme was about to unravel. I watched as he walked the perimeter, making notes, taking photos, and examining everything carefully. Every stake and blind was documented, every footprint accounted for. It was methodical, professional, and completely undeniable. Meanwhile, the neighbor had apparently noticed the warden arriving because I saw him peek over his fence a few houses down, looking worried, muttering to himself. I imagined the internal panic. He had probably thought he was being clever, lining up hunters, making a little extra cash on the side, but now his plan was crumbling. And the best part? He couldn't argue, he couldn't deny, and he certainly couldn't undo the evidence. The warden spent about an hour inspecting everything, asking a few questions, and ensuring that the boundaries were clearly defined. I answered calmly, without anger, just stating the facts. By the end, he nodded and said, I'll issue a citation for illegal hunting agreements and unauthorized access. You did everything right by documenting it and alerting us. Good job. I felt a rush of relief, satisfaction, and a little quiet triumph. The law was on my side, and the neighbor's bold plan had backfired spectacularly. As the warden drove off, promising to follow up with formal paperwork, I walked through the property one last time that evening. The air was calm, the forest serene, and the stakes and blinds were still there, but now they were marked and noted, evidence for the records. My land had been invaded, yes, but justice had arrived, quietly and efficiently. I could almost hear the neighbor muttering to himself, realizing that playing fast and loose with other people's property has consequences. That night, as the sun set and cast long shadows across the woodland, I reflected on the events. This wasn't just about hunting rights or property. It was about vigilance, preparation, and knowing when to involve the proper authorities. It was about standing up for yourself calmly, documenting everything, and letting the system work in your favor. And in a way, it was a little amusing to imagine the neighbor facing the consequences he hadn't anticipated, all because he underestimated me. So that's how it started. A simple walk through my land, noticing something odd, and realizing someone had tried to profit off my property without asking. Little did they know, I had been paying attention, and now, the stage was set for the next day, when the warden would issue the fine, and the neighbor would have to reckon with the results of his audacity. By the next morning, I could feel the tension in the air. The previous day's discoveries hadn't gone unnoticed. Tire tracks, stakes, and the little blinds set up by the hunters were still there, and now, the neighbor was pacing nervously on his side of the fence. I could see him peeking over occasionally, muttering under his breath, clearly realizing that his plan wasn't going to go as smoothly as he had imagined. I decided to stay put, keeping calm, letting the evidence speak for itself. I walked along the perimeter of my property, taking more photos of the stakes and footpaths. Every shot, every note was another layer of proof. I could almost hear the neighbor imagining what would happen when the game warden showed up. There was a quiet satisfaction in that anticipation, a subtle thrill at knowing the system was on my side. By mid-morning, I heard the distinctive hum of the warden's truck approaching. The man himself stepped out, uniform crisp, boots crunching on the dirt path, eyes scanning the area with professional precision. "All right," he said, clipboard in hand. "Let's take a look at this situation." I led him along the perimeter, pointing out the stakes, the paths, and the small tree blinds. The warden's eyes widened slightly. "This is organized," he muttered. "They've definitely made it look official." He paused, then scribbled notes on his clipboard. "But none of this has your permission?" I shook my head. "Not a single part. They sold hunting rights on my land without asking me." He looked back toward the neighbor's house, who was now hovering nervously by the fence. The neighbor's eyes darted between us, clearly aware that this was serious. "That's bold," the warden said, shaking his head. "And illegal." He made a few more notes, then turned to me. "You did the right thing by documenting everything and contacting us immediately." As the warden moved through the property, inspecting the blinds and markers, the neighbor began to pace more aggressively, muttering under his breath. I could hear snippets. I didn't think they'd actually, and I'll talk to them. It was clear he had no idea how to handle this. And the beauty of it was, I didn't need to say a word. The evidence and the presence of the warden spoke volumes. The warden then called over a couple of his colleagues. Together, they began taking photographs, measuring the stakes, and cross-referencing the boundaries with official property maps. Every action they took reinforced the fact that the neighbor's actions were entirely unauthorized. The neighbor tried to step closer, maybe to argue, maybe to plead, but I gently stepped in front, not aggressively, just enough to assert my presence. "You understand that what's been done here is considered a violation, right?" the warden asked the neighbor, eyes sharp, clipboard in hand. The neighbor's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. He tried to respond, but the words sounded weak, unconvincing. I thought it was okay," he stammered. The warden shook his head. "Permission must come from the property owner. That's the law." I watched quietly as the neighbor's expression shifted from surprise to panic. The hunters who had already arrived were now realizing they were trespassing illegally, their confident chatter replaced with uneasy silence. The tension was tangible, a mix of embarrassment, fear, and disbelief. It was the perfect scene, a clever, methodical victory without shouting, without violence, just evidence and authority doing the work. I took a few more steps along the riverbank, pointing out additional stakes and minor markers the hunters had placed. The warden nodded, clearly noting each violation. "We'll need to issue fines and citations for the unauthorized hunting rights," he said. The neighbor's shoulders slumped slightly. You could see the moment he realized there was no escape from the consequences. As the afternoon wore on, the warden prepared the formal documentation. He called over the hunters, explained the legal boundaries, and made it clear that any future activity on my property without explicit permission would result in immediate action. The neighbor attempted one last excuse, something about miscommunication or thinking it was okay. But the warden ignored him politely and continued his process. I couldn't help but chuckle quietly. The neighbor had tried to make a quick profit, and now, thanks to his own overconfidence and lack of planning, he was facing fines and embarrassment in front of both the authorities and a few curious neighbors who had been watching from a distance. The lesson was clear. You can't manipulate someone's property without consequences. After about an hour, the citations were issued, photographs logged, and the warden confirmed that my property was now secure. He shook my hand, smiling. You handled this perfectly. Documentation, patience, and letting the law do its work. It's the best approach. I nodded, a quiet sense of satisfaction washing over me. The neighbor, meanwhile, shuffled back to his house, muttering and clearly plotting how he would explain this mess to anyone who had asked. Later that evening, I walked the property again, noting the restored peace. The stakes were gone, the riverbank was calm, and the silence of my land was restored. The neighbor's scheme had been neutralized, not with confrontation or anger, but with methodical observation, documentation, and the proper authorities. It was a subtle but complete victory, one that reinforced both my ownership and the importance of patience and strategy. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the property, I reflected on the events. This wasn't just about hunting rights or fines. It was a lesson in vigilance, responsibility, and the quiet power of standing up. For what's yours? The neighbor may have thought he could get away with it, but careful observation, preparation, and the proper channels of law ensured justice was served. That night, as the stars began to appear and the property returned to its usual calm, I knew that the story wasn't over in people's minds. Neighbors would talk. The tale of the unauthorized hunting rights and the clever way it was resolved would circulate. And while the warden had issued the fines, the real victory was that my land, my property, and my rules were respected, and everyone who had doubted that had learned a lesson. By the next day, the air around my property felt calm but tense, like the quiet just before everyone accepts what's inevitable. The game warden had returned to finalize the paperwork, and I could see the neighbor pacing nervously from his porch, glancing toward my land every few seconds. He probably wasn't expecting the law to act so efficiently, and I have to admit, that gave me a quiet satisfaction. The warden stepped out of his truck, clipboard in hand, a professional air about him, and began inspecting the property once more. We'll be issuing formal citations today, he said. I nodded, maintaining a casual calm that made the neighbor shift uncomfortably. All evidence has been documented, every stake, every blind, and every pathway. The property boundaries are clear. His tone was firm, leaving no room for dispute. The neighbor finally ventured closer, trying to justify his actions. I didn't think it would be a problem, he stammered, voice shaky. I thought the hunters just, he trailed off, clearly realizing the futility of his argument. The warden didn't respond. He simply wrote his notes, methodically recording the violation. The neighbor's silence spoke volumes. It was the moment where his audacity met reality. Meanwhile, a few neighbors had come out to watch discreetly, curious about the outcome. Their whispers carried through the quiet property, and I could see the subtle judgment in their eyes. Some shook their heads, others offered faint nods of approval. It was like a small audience witnessing justice being quietly served, and I could feel the weight of social acknowledgement adding to the legal enforcement. The warden called the hunters over one by one, explaining the situation, marking their trespass, and making it clear that any future unauthorized hunting would be met with immediate consequences. The hunters looked embarrassed, murmuring apologies or explanations, but it was too late. Everything was on record. The neighbor, however, was the one facing the brunt of the authority. His face reflected a mix of frustration, disbelief, and reluctant acceptance. I stayed quietly on the property, observing, letting the law and the natural order unfold. I didn't need to argue, to shout, or to show aggression. The combination of preparation, evidence, and authority had done the work for me. Every stake, every footprint, every blind that had been placed without permission now contributed to the neighbor's reckoning. I felt a mix of amusement and satisfaction. Justice had arrived quietly, efficiently, and undeniably. As the warden finalized the citations, the neighbor's posture slumped, a visible acknowledgement of his failure. He muttered under his breath, clearly trying to figure out how to explain this situation to anyone who had asked. I couldn't help but smile faintly. There's a unique satisfaction in seeing someone's own miscalculations play out in such a precise and public way. By late afternoon, the warden had completed his work. He shook my hand firmly. "You handled this perfectly," he said. "Documentation, patience, letting the law do its work. It's the best approach." I nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction, not from triumph over a person, but from seeing the law and fairness prevail. The neighbor had learned the hard way that property rights are serious, and that shortcuts or greed can quickly backfire. Later, as the day waned and the sun began to set over the property, I walked along the paths that had been briefly invaded. Everything was back in order, the stakes removed, the land peaceful, and the riverbanks quiet. The property felt restored, not just physically but symbolically. My land, my boundaries, and my authority had been recognized and upheld. I paused for a moment, looking over the quiet woodland. The birds chirped softly, the wind rustled through the trees, and the subtle glow of the setting sun bathed the property in a warm light. It was peaceful, and in that peace, there was a clear message. Careful observation, preparation, and use of proper authority can protect what is yours without unnecessary confrontation. Reflecting on the events, I realized this situation had taught me more than just vigilance over land. It was a lesson in patience, strategy, and respect for process. Confrontation, yelling, or impulsive action could have escalated tensions unnecessarily. Instead, I documented, involved the authorities, and let the law enforce justice. The neighbor's audacity had been countered not with anger, but with careful, deliberate action. As night fell, I took one last walk through the property. The moonlight shimmered on the riverbank, casting gentle shadows where the stakes and blinds had once stood. The land felt safe, calm, and restored. The neighbors' schemes had failed, the hunters had been warned, and the law had prevailed. It was more than a victory over a trespass. It was a reinforcement of boundaries, rights, and careful, thoughtful action. And here's the part for anyone watching. If someone encroaches on your property, whether intentionally or out of ignorance, the best approach isn't always confrontation. Document, observe, and involve the proper authorities. Protect what's yours wisely, strategically, and legally. Sometimes the quietest actions speak the loudest, and the results are far more satisfying than any shouting match. Finally, I want to leave a question for viewers. What would you do if someone tried to exploit your land without permission? Have you ever had to defend your property against someone else's greed or carelessness? Share your experiences in the comments below. Let's talk about how to protect what's yours while staying smart and calm. Standing there under the starlit sky, I felt a sense of calm authority. My land was mine. My rights were respected. The neighbor had learned his lesson, quietly but unmistakably. And sometimes, that's all the satisfaction you need. Knowing that careful observation, preparation, and strategic action have upheld justice without a single shout, without a single reckless move, and without unnecessary confrontation.